Ex-German High Command, Night, Berlin. Winter, 1941. Snow falls silently on the stone eagles guarding the entrance. Inside, the air is thick with cigar smoke and the scent of old leather. In a map-lined room, deep within the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the architects of Blitzkrieg gather. Their uniforms are immaculate, their posture rigid. Confidence is the only accepted currency here. An intelligence officer presents a new set of figures. American industrial projections for 1942. A low chuckle ripples through the room. The numbers are absurd, fantastical. Tens of thousands of planes, thousands of tanks. A navy built from scratch. To these men, masters of the European continent, America is a nation of merchants and movie stars, not warriors. Their army is a ghost. Their industry, a peacetime machine incapable of rapid conversion. They dismiss the report as propaganda, a desperate bluff from a decadent nation. They were staring directly at the intelligence reports, at the cold, hard data. But they could not see the weapon that would ultimately seal their fate. The weapon they could not see was not a secret technology. It was not a revolutionary tank or a faster airplane. It was a system, a philosophy of production forged in peacetime, which the German High Command, with its rigid, martial worldview, was utterly incapable of understanding. By the close of 1941, their worldview seemed infallible. The map of Europe was painted in field gray. Poland had fallen in 27 days. Denmark and Norway seized in a matter of hours. The Netherlands, Belgium, France. The great military power of the continent, with its vaunted army, had capitulated in just 6 weeks. The swastika flew from the Eiffel Tower. The British had been humiliated, driven into the sea at Dunkirk, and now stood alone, battered by the Luftwaffe and starved by U-boats. To the east, Operation Barbarossa had unleashed the largest land invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers surged across the Soviet frontier. By December, forward reconnaissance units could see the distant spires of the Kremlin through their field glasses. They had captured 4 million Soviet soldiers and conquered territory holding 40% of its population. The Wehrmacht was the most feared, battle-hardened military machine on the planet. Its victories were not accidents. They were the product of superior training, superior doctrine, and what they believed to be a superior industrial base, tailored exclusively for the singular purpose of war. In this world of total war, America was a phantom, a distant, irrelevant giant. Its military was a footnote. In 1940, the United States Army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than the Army of Portugal. It was a skeleton force of less than 200,000 men, armed with relics from the Great War. Its tanks were flimsy, riveted machines, no match for a Panzer III. Its Air Corps flew outdated planes. During the massive Louisiana maneuvers of September 1941, a desperate dress rehearsal for a war America was not yet in. The deficiencies were on stark display. Soldiers trained with wooden mock-ups of machine guns. Trucks, with the word tank crudely painted on their sides, stood in for armored divisions. To observers in Berlin, it was a pantomime of modern warfare, confirming every German prejudice about American softness. This prejudice ran deeper than military comparisons. It was ideological. The German command saw America's greatest strength, its sprawling, consumer-driven, capitalist economy, as its most profound weakness. How could a nation obsessed with producing millions of automobiles, refrigerators, and nylon stockings compete with the focused, state-controlled might of the Third Reich? German intelligence saw factories governed by profit margins, not by the Führer's directives. They saw a workforce accustomed to union disputes and the 40-hour work week, not the iron discipline of a people geared for conquest. They saw complexity and decadence, not martial efficiency. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's call for America to become the great arsenal of democracy was heard in Berlin, but it was dismissed as hollow posturing. The Lend-Lease Act of March 1941, which began funneling supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union, was viewed as a desperate gambit by a nation unwilling to fight its own battles. The initial shipments were a mere trickle, reinforcing the belief that American industry was too slow, too chaotic, to ever become a decisive factor. What the German planners failed to see was the foundation upon which this consumer society was built. It was a foundation of immense, untouchable natural resources. Endless fields of oil in Texas, mountains of iron ore from the Mesabi Range, rivers of coal from Appalachia, all of it thousands of miles from the nearest Axis bomber base. They failed to appreciate the culture of innovation that drove this economy. The very men who had perfected the mass production of the family car and the kitchen appliance were still there. They were engineers, managers, and assembly line workers who understood scale in a way no European nation did. They didn't just build things. They built the systems that built things, faster and in greater numbers than anyone imagined possible. The German generals saw the numbers in their intelligence reports as an impossible target. They failed to understand that for America, these numbers were just a starting point. They saw the product, but they could not comprehend the process. The process they could not comprehend was a uniquely American invention. It was a philosophy born not in a war room, but on the factory floors of Detroit. It was the moving assembly line perfected by Henry Ford, a river of steel and human effort, flowing 24 hours a day. Each worker a specialist in a single, repeated motion. Each part delivered to the precise point it was needed at the precise second. It was a system designed to build millions of identical, complex machines for a nation of consumers. It valued speed, volume, and efficiency above all else. The German industrial model was its polar opposite. It was a system of master craftsmen. Their factories produced the world's finest cameras, the most precise machine tools, and the most technologically advanced tanks. But they were built with a watchmaker's precision. Production was methodical, meticulous, and slow. A Panzer tank was a masterpiece of engineering, assembled by skilled artisans. It was not designed to be mass-produced by semi-skilled labor. This reliance on specialized craftsmanship was a source of immense pride, but it was also a strategic bottleneck. Germany could build better, but it could not build faster. Their entire industrial base was configured for quality, not quantity. The concept of converting a civilian plant making kitchen stoves into a factory producing artillery shells was, to them, a slow and arduous process, not an overnight transformation. This fundamental misunderstanding led to their greatest strategic miscalculation. German intelligence looked at the sprawling American automobile industry and saw only a liability. They saw a system geared for civilian comfort, not military necessity. They could not conceive that the same factories stamping out body panels for a Ford sedan could be retooled to stamp out the wings of a B-24 Liberator. They could not imagine that the men who had mastered the logistics of supplying thousands of dealerships with spare parts could apply that same genius to supplying an army across 2 oceans. They saw a nation of competing corporations, driven by profit, and failed to see how quickly that competition could be harnessed by a single existential threat. That threat arrived on a quiet Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a tactical masterpiece. It crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. But it was also the single greatest strategic blunder of the war. In 1 hour and 15 minutes, Japan did what years of political debate could not. It unified America. The arguments over isolationism vanished in the smoke rising from the Arizona. The illusion of distance, of a European war fought by others, was shattered. The next day, President Roosevelt stood before Congress. His voice, steady and grim, declared a state of war. But he did more than that. He issued a challenge, a production directive that sounded to many like pure fantasy. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943, 120,000 tanks, 8 million tons of shipping. In Berlin, these were the same numbers that had been laughed at just months before. Now, they were not a projection. They were a promise, a declaration of industrial war. Across the United States, the change was immediate and absolute. On February 10, 1942, the last civilian automobile rolled off an American assembly line, a Packard. After that, the plants went silent, but only for a moment. Then came the sound of demolition crews, of engineers shouting over blueprints, of machinery being ripped from its foundations. The vast, intricate ecosystems designed to satisfy consumer desire were being systematically re-engineered for destruction. The Great Arsenal was no longer a political slogan. It was becoming a physical reality. The blueprint for this industrial war existed, but it would take a unique group of men, titans of a world the German high command despised, to turn that blueprint into a weapon. The first of these titans was a man who knew nothing of military strategy, but everything about building things. His name was William S. Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who had risen to become the president of General Motors. In 1940, Roosevelt summoned him to Washington. Knudsen arrived not in a uniform, but in a business suit, a thick-set man with a rumbling voice who spoke the blunt language of the factory floor. He walked into the marbled halls of government, a world of lawyers and bureaucrats, and was appalled by the inaction. He saw plans, committees, and endless debate. He wanted to see chips fly. He was given the monumental task of organizing the entire American industrial conversion for war. He had no formal authority, only the president's trust and his own immense reputation. He treated the war not as a military campaign, but as the ultimate production problem. He called his old rivals, the heads of Ford and Chrysler, and told them to put aside their competition. He told them what the Army needed and asked a simple question: how fast can you build it? To the military brass, who demanded custom-built perfection, he was often a frustration. He championed standardization, simplification, and speed over bespoke design. He wasn't building a single perfect weapon. He was building the machine that would build millions of them. Knudsen was the embodiment of the weapon the Germans could not see. A civilian genius of logistics and scale, applying the ruthless efficiency of the assembly line to the chaos of war. This new machine for war needed an army to run it, not an army of soldiers, but of workers. 16 million Americans would eventually serve in uniform. But nearly 19 million more would serve on the home front, in the mines, mills, and factories. It was the greatest internal migration in American history. Workers from the Dust Bowl, Appalachia, and the Deep South poured into cities like Detroit, Seattle, and Los Angeles. And for the first time, they were joined by millions of women. They were called to leave their homes and take up rivet guns and welding torches. They learned to operate massive stamping presses and overhead cranes. They built the ships, tanks, and planes their husbands, sons, and brothers would take into battle. The factory floor became a social crucible. Men and women, black and white, working side by side, often for the first time. The shifts ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The rhythmic clang of the factory, the glare of molten steel, the scent of machine oil. This became the new sensory landscape for a generation. The German High Command saw a soft, consumerist society. They did not see this hidden reservoir of human capital, this willingness of a free people to voluntarily subject themselves to industrial discipline for a common cause. They could not imagine a nation transforming its entire civilian population into a single, unified production line. The production line itself was being radically reimagined. Before the war, building a heavy bomber like the B-24 Liberator was a craftsman's job. It was assembled in a fixed position, like a house, with teams of skilled mechanics swarming over it for weeks. It was the German model, quality through artisanship. But the Ford Motor Company saw it differently. At a new, purpose-built factory at Willow Run, Michigan, they applied the logic of the automobile to the complexity of the airplane. The plant itself was a marvel, a single assembly line over a mile long. The B-24 was broken down into thousands of smaller, simpler components. Each component was built on its own subassembly line, then fed into the main line at the precise moment it was needed. Unskilled workers, many of whom had never seen an airplane before, were trained to perform a single, repetitive task. One person installed a specific hydraulic line. Another riveted a single wing panel. It was a brutal, dehumanizing, and breathtakingly efficient system. The process turned the bomber from a handcrafted masterpiece into a mass-produced commodity. At its peak, a gleaming 4-engine B-24 Liberator, ready for war, was rolling out of the Willow Run doors every 63 minutes. This was the process made manifest. The factory itself had become the weapon, and its ammunition was time. Time was the ammunition. But the factory was a fixed fortress. Its output was useless unless it could cross 2 oceans. In the North Atlantic, German U-boats were waging the most successful war of attrition in history. Wolf packs, commanded by masters like Karl Dönitz, were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be built. For every new tank that left Detroit, for every crate of shells packed in Ohio, there was a very real chance it would end up in the cold, dark waters between Halifax and Liverpool. The German High Command saw this as a choke point they could control indefinitely. They had not accounted for men like Henry J. Kaiser. He was not a shipbuilder. He was a construction magnate who had built dams and bridges. He looked at a ship not as a singular vessel, but as a collection of parts to be assembled. He discarded the time-honored tradition of riveting, which required skilled artisans, and embraced welding. He pioneered prefabrication, building massive sections of a ship, the bow, the deckhouse, the stern, in separate facilities, and then lifting them into place with giant cranes. The shipyard became an open-air assembly line. The results were staggering. A Liberty ship, a simple but massive cargo vessel, initially took over 200 days to construct. By 1943, Kaiser's yards were launching one every 42 days, then every week. At its peak, his Richmond, California yard launched the SS Robert E. Peary just 4 days and 15 hours after its keel was laid. Germany was sinking ships, but America was building a bridge of steel across the ocean, launching them faster than the U-boats could find their targets. This torrent of production was matched by a revolution in innovation, organized with the same industrial logic. The weapon was not just America's brawn, it was its brain. In Washington, a civilian scientist named Vannevar Bush convinced President Roosevelt to create an unprecedented organization, the Office of Scientific Research and Development, or OSRD. It was a direct line between the nation's brightest minds and the military's most urgent problems. Bush mobilized thousands of physicists, chemists, and engineers from universities and corporate labs, turning the entire American scientific community into a weapon development program. They didn't wear uniforms. They worked in secret at places like MIT and Caltech. Their breakthroughs were quiet, but decisive. They perfected microwave radar, shrinking it down to fit into the nose of a night fighter, turning the hunter into the hunted. They developed the proximity fuse, a tiny radio transceiver in an artillery shell that detonated it near a target without a direct hit, devastating Luftwaffe formations and V-1 flying bombs. They took the British laboratory discovery of penicillin and, applying American mass production techniques, created millions of doses of the miracle drug that saved more lives than any other single invention of the war. The German High Command, which had prided itself on its technological superiority, was now facing an enemy that was not just outproducing it, but systematically out-inventing it. The system's true strength, however, was its resilience, its ability to solve a problem that threatened its very existence. In early 1942, the Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia cut off 90% of the Allied supply of natural rubber. Without it, there would be no tires for trucks, no seals for hydraulic systems, no insulation for wiring. The entire war machine would grind to a halt. To the Axis powers, it seemed like a fatal, strategic blow. The American response was not to conserve, but to create. The government marshaled the nation's chemical and petroleum industries in a crash program of breathtaking scale and expense. It was a gamble on a scale with the Manhattan Project. Factories were built before the final chemical processes were even perfected. Competing companies were forced to share patents and trade secrets. Within 2 years, American production of synthetic rubber went from almost nothing to over 800,000 tons a year, more than the entire world's pre-war output of natural rubber. The Germans saw a decadent nation dependent on global supply lines. They failed to understand that if a resource was denied, this new kind of arsenal would simply invent a new one. The factories were running. The ships were sailing. The laboratories were delivering miracles on a deadline. The great weapon, hidden in plain sight, was now fully forged. Its components, steel, ingenuity, and sheer human will, were converging. Now, this avalanche of materiel, a flood of unimaginable scale, was about to crash upon the battlefields of a world at war. The first waves of this avalanche did not crash upon a beachhead, but into the cold, thin air 6 miles above the European continent. The testing ground was the sky over the Third Reich. The weapon was the 8th Air Force, and its primary instrument was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Each one was a 4-engine, 10-man symbol of American industrial philosophy. It was not the fastest or most agile bomber. It was a rugged, mass-produced platform for carrying 5,000 pounds of explosives to a target. It bristled with 13 .50 caliber machine guns, earning it its name. American doctrine, born of confidence and technological optimism, dictated these bombers would fly in broad daylight, in tight formations, to surgically destroy the factories, rail yards, and oil refineries that fueled the German war machine. They would defend themselves in massive, interlocking fields of fire, the combat box formation. They would fly without fighter escort deep into enemy territory. It was a theory, a brutal, costly experiment waiting to happen. The German defenders were the elite of the Luftwaffe. Men like Adolf Galland and Werner Milders had forged a corps of fighter pilots, the Experten, who were masters of their craft. They had battled the RAF to a standstill and annihilated the Soviet Air Force on the ground. They flew the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the formidable Focke-Wulf FW-190, fast, agile, cannon-armed interceptors that were more than a match for any Allied fighter. When the first B-17s appeared over France in the summer of 1942, the German pilots were dismissive. The bombers were slow, predictable. They believed they could be shot down with ease. At first, the losses were manageable. The raids were shallow against U-boat pens and airfields in occupied France. But with every passing month, the numbers grew. The trickle of bombers arriving in England became a steady stream, then a river. General Ira Eaker, the commander of the 8th Air Force, kept demanding more planes, more crews. He promised that with enough mass, he could break the back of the Luftwaffe. By the spring of 1943, the raids were growing in size and audacity. 100 bombers, then 200. They pushed deeper into the Low Countries, then into Germany itself. The German pilots adapted with lethal ingenuity. They discovered the B-17's weakness, a limited number of forward-firing guns. They developed the terrifying head-on attack, flying directly into the bomber formations, cannons blazing, forcing a deadly game of chicken with the American pilots. The air war became a grim calculus of production versus attrition. For every bomber that fell, spiraling toward the German countryside in a plume of black smoke, 2 more arrived from the factories at Seattle and Willow Run to take its place. For every veteran German pilot lost, the replacement was younger, less experienced. The German system, built on quality and craftsmanship, could not replace its master artisans at the same rate America could replace its mass-produced machines and the men who flew them. The pressure was immense. The Luftwaffe was forced to pull its best fighter groups away from the Eastern Front, away from the Mediterranean, to defend the homeland. The American industrial weapon was achieving a strategic objective without a single soldier setting foot on German soil. It was forcing the enemy to react, to bleed its strength defending its own factories. Now, the Americans decided to strike at the heart of that system. The targets were chosen with industrial logic: the Messerschmitt aircraft factories in Regensburg, and, most critically, the ball-bearing plants in the city of Schweinfurt. Nearly half of all of Germany's ball bearings, an essential component for every tank, plane, and engine, were produced in a handful of factories in this one small town. To destroy them was to induce a fatal paralysis in the entire German war effort. The date is set: August 17th, 1943. It will be the largest, deepest penetration raid yet attempted. A dual-pronged assault. 376 heavy bombers will rise from the fields of England. One force will strike Regensburg and, in a daring move, continue on to airfields in North Africa. The second, larger force will hit Schweinfurt and turn for home. They will have fighter escort only to the German border. For hundreds of miles, over the most heavily defended airspace in the world, they will be on their own. Dawn breaks over East Anglia. The air is cold, thick with the smell of damp earth and high-octane fuel. On dozens of airfields, engines sputter to life, a low rumble that grows into a deafening roar. The ground crews make their final checks. The flight crews, young men barely out of their teens, climb aboard, their faces etched with a mixture of bravado and quiet fear. One by one, the silver giants lift into the sky, heavy with fuel and bombs, struggling for altitude. They form up over the English Channel, a vast, terrifyingly beautiful armada of wings and steel, glinting in the morning sun. a city in the sky, moving at 200 miles an hour toward the heart of the enemy. Over Belgium, the P-47 Thunderbolt escorts peel away, their fuel running low. The bomber crews are now alone. Their radios crackle with warnings. Below, across the green German landscape, the Luftwaffe is rising to meet them. Hundreds of fighters, climbing like angry hornets, vectors converging on the bomber stream. The German generals had laughed at the numbers. Now, the numbers are coming for them. The attack comes without warning. Not a single fighter, but a wave. Then another. The German pilots are disciplined, methodical. They ignore the stragglers and focus their fury on the lead formations, aiming to kill the commanders and navigators, to shatter the cohesion of the combat box. From the cockpit of a B-17, the sky transforms from an empty blue expanse into a lethal, three-dimensional geometry of contrails and tracer fire. The Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts do not engage in elegant dogfights. They approach head-on, flying through their own flak, their wing-mounted cannons spitting 20mm shells that tear through aluminum skin like paper. The closing speed is over 500 miles per hour. The American gunners have less than 2 seconds to aim and fire before the fighter flashes past or through their formation. Inside the bombers, the temperature is 40 degrees below zero. The noise is a physical assault. The constant roar of the engines, the violent chatter of the 50 caliber guns, the percussive thud of enemy shells striking the fuselage. Waist gunners, tethered by oxygen lines and intercom cords, wrestle their heavy machine guns, their vision obscured by smoke and the glare of the sun. They see a friendly bomber, flying just yards away, suddenly blossom into a bright orange fireball. They see parachutes, small white dots against the vastness, some open, some trailing fire. The combat box, so perfect in theory, begins to fray. A damaged fortress, trailing smoke from a dead engine, falls out of formation. Instantly, it is swarmed by fighters, a pack of wolves isolating a weakened animal. There is no mercy in this sky. The German pilots attack with rockets fired from tubes under their wings. They are inaccurate, but a single hit can disintegrate a bomber. The air is filled with shrapnel, debris, and falling men. Yet the armada does not turn back. The pilots hold their course, flying through the maelstrom. Over Regensburg, the bomb bay doors grind open. Sticks of high explosives rain down on the Messerschmitt factories below. Over Schweinfurt, the sky is black with the thick, greasy puffs of anti-aircraft fire. The lead bombardiers, peering through their Norden bomb sights, guide the formations through the flak, releasing their payloads into the heart of the German ball-bearing industry. Smoke and fire begin to rise from the targets. They have delivered their message. But the journey home is a new kind of hell. The formation is shattered. The bombers are low on fuel and ammunition. Many are crippled, flying on 2 or 3 engines. The Luftwaffe returns, rearmed and refueled, to finish the job. For another 200 miles, the slaughter continues. Lone bombers fight desperate, running battles until their guns fall silent or their wings shear off. As the survivors limp across the English Channel, the scale of the disaster becomes clear. The formations are ghosts of what they were. The ground crews at the air bases wait, scanning the skies, counting the returning planes. The silence from the empty hardstands is deafening. That day, the 8th Air Force loses 60 heavy bombers. 600 young men are gone, killed, captured, or missing in the heart of the Reich. It is the costliest day in its history. In Berlin, the reports are cause for celebration. The Luftwaffe has won a stunning victory. They have proven that American industrial might can be bled white in the skies over Germany. The theory of self-defending daylight bombing is dead, shattered by the cannons of the Expertin. The German High Command sees the empty spaces in the American formations and believes they have broken the weapon. They see a victory. What they cannot see is the reaction taking place thousands of miles away. They hear the cheers of their pilots, but they do not hear the sound of telephones ringing in Washington, of directives being issued in Detroit. They do not understand the nature of the machine they have wounded. The machine does not despair. It calculates, it learns, and it adapts. The sky over Schweinfurt had taught a terrible lesson. The weapon was not invincible. But its ability to learn from its own destruction was a power the Third Reich had fatally underestimated. The lesson was paid for in blood. As the last crippled bombers sputtered onto English runways, the cost was tallied in the quiet, methodical language of war. 60 bombers lost, 594 crewmen missing, a further 55 aircraft damaged, many beyond repair. In the Nielsen huts and briefing rooms of the 8th Air Force, there was a stunned silence. Empty bunks, unclaimed meals. The confidence that had launched the Great Armada that morning was gone, replaced by a cold, grim understanding of the price of admission to the German sky. In Berlin, the reports were read with triumph. The Luftwaffe had dealt the Americans a staggering blow. Fighter pilots recounted their victories. Intelligence officers confirmed the bomber losses. To the German High Command, this was proof of concept. Their strategy of defense, their superior pilots and aircraft, had broken the American assault. They had met industrial mass with martial skill, and skill had won. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarschall of the Luftwaffe, saw vindication of his Air Force. The myth of the self-defending flying fortress had been torn apart in a single afternoon. They believed the Americans would be forced to abandon their costly daylight strategy. They had won the battle. But deep within the Reich's Ministry for Armaments, a different story was unfolding. The reports arriving on the desk of Albert Speer were not about aerial victories. They were damage assessments, photographs of twisted steel girders and shattered factory floors in Schweinfurt, production figures that had fallen off a cliff. The bombing, though costly for the attackers, had been terrifyingly accurate. And in a few minutes, the raid had wiped out 38% of Germany's ball-bearing production. The intricate machinery of the Wehrmacht, every tank, every airplane, every U-boat, depended on these small steel spheres. The entire war effort ran on them. After the war, Speer would state that the American failure to immediately and repeatedly strike Schweinfurt was one of the greatest missed opportunities of the war. He lived in terror of a second raid, a third. He knew what his victorious pilots did not, that the American weapon, though blunted, had struck a potentially fatal blow. The German leadership saw the 60 fallen bombers. Speer saw the vulnerability of the entire industrial heartland, now proven to be within reach. This knowledge also existed in High Wycombe, at the headquarters of the 8th Air Force. Reconnaissance photos, taken by lone, high-speed mosquitoes, confirmed the devastation. The theory was correct. Precision daylight bombing could cripple German industry. But the German victory in the air was also an undeniable fact. The loss rate of 16% was unsustainable. No force could survive it. To send the bombers back to Schweinfurt the next day or the next week would be suicide. The American war machine was faced with a paradox. It had built a key capable of unlocking the door to victory, but the key was too brittle to turn. The raids deep into Germany were called off. An unofficial, undeclared truce settled over the skies of the Reich. The German fighter pilots rested and rearmed, confident they had secured their airspace. The American bomber crews waited, flying safer, shorter missions, wondering if they would ever be asked to face that wall of flak and fighters again. The great weapon, the mass-produced bomber, was not enough. It had proven it could deliver the blow, but it could not survive the journey. The machine had learned its lesson, and now it demanded a new component, a new piece of technology that could solve the fatal equation of the air war. The demand was for range. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a titan, a rugged beast that could absorb incredible punishment, but it was thirsty. The Lockheed P-38, Lightning, had the legs, but not in the numbers required. The solution was found in a marriage of transatlantic genius. An American airframe, the North American P-51 Mustang, was paired with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same legendary engine that had powered the Spitfire. With new internal fuel tanks and external drop tanks, the Mustang could fly from England to Berlin, fight for 30 minutes, and fly home. It was the key. But a single key is a curiosity. 1,000 keys can open an empire. At its plant in Inglewood, California, North American Aviation was not crafting masterpieces. It was applying the same industrial logic that built bombers and automobiles to the production of fighter planes. By 1944, they were producing Mustangs on a moving assembly line, completing a new fighter in a fraction of the time it took to build its German counterpart. The weapon was not just the P-51, it was the ability to produce P-51s by the hundreds every month. In January 1944, a new commander arrived to lead the 8th Air Force, General Jimmy Doolittle. He looked at the equation of the air war and rewrote it. The old doctrine was for fighters to stay close to the bombers, a defensive shield. Doolittle issued a new predatory command. The primary mission of the fighters was no longer to protect the bombers. It was to hunt, to seek out and destroy the German Air Force. He unleashed his little friends. The change was immediate. For the bomber crews, the sight of the Mustangs arriving was a deliverance. They would appear as tiny silver specks in the distance, a promise that the lonely, terrifying part of the journey was over. For the German pilots, it was a nightmare. They would rise to intercept the bomber streams only to find themselves ambushed by swarms of American fighters. The hunters had become the hunted. The skies over their own airfields were no longer safe. In the last week of February 1944, Doolittle launched Big Week. It was the Schweinfurt Raid reborn, but on an unimaginable scale. Over 1,000 bombers, escorted by nearly 1,000 fighters, struck the German aircraft industry day after day. The Luftwaffe had no choice but to rise and fight. And it was slaughtered. The American industrial weapon was now a combined arms force. The bombers were the bait. The Mustangs were the trap. The German system, which prized the skilled pilot above all, could not sustain the losses. Veteran experten were shot down and killed. Their replacements were undertrained boys, thrown into the meat grinder with barely enough hours to fly, let alone fight. The German High Command had won the Battle of Schweinfurt in August 1943. But they had lost the war for the sky by March 1944. The weapon they had dismissed had adapted. It had identified a weakness, designed a solution, and mass-produced it on a scale that defied comprehension. The result was air supremacy. Not just superiority, but total crushing dominance of the sky. This victory was the final, critical prerequisite for the entire Allied strategy. On June 6, 1944, as the largest amphibious force in history approached the beaches of Normandy, the sky above them was filled with Allied aircraft. The Luftwaffe was a ghost. German commanders on the ground pleaded for air support that would never come. Panzer divisions attempting to race to the coast were spotted and savaged by P-47s and Typhoons. The German army, the most formidable fighting force on the planet, was now fighting with one arm tied behind its back, its eyes blinded to the sky. The laughter in that Berlin map room in 1941 had long since died. The fantastical numbers from the American intelligence reports were no longer a joke. They were a reality, painted in steel and fire across the face of Europe. The weapon hidden in plain sight was never just about the factory. It was about the philosophy behind it, a relentless, remorseless, and ultimately overwhelming logic of industrial war. That logic would grind on for another 11 bloody months, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the heart of Berlin. The German army would fight with skill and ferocity, but it was a body starving for the fuel, the steel, and the replacements that its shattered industry could no longer provide. The final verdict was not delivered by a general, but by an assembly line. The German High Command had prepared for a war of maneuver and elan, of superior training and tactical genius. They were confronted instead by a war of logistics and attrition, waged with slide rules, production schedules, and the relentless ticking of the factory clock. The weapon was never just the machines. It was the people who conceived, built, and operated them. A generation that had learned to dream of a new car or modern kitchen was asked instead to build a global arsenal. They answered not with the forced discipline of a totalitarian state, but with the shared, voluntary effort of a free society mobilized for survival. Their battlefield was the factory floor. Their uniform was a pair of overalls, and their victory was measured in shipping tonnage and production quotas. In the end, the German generals were not wrong about America. It was a nation of merchants and consumers, of competing corporations and union men. What they failed to understand was that this was not a weakness. It was the source of a resilient, adaptable, and ultimately inexhaustible power. A power that could turn a refrigerator factory into a producer of aircraft parts, and a construction magnate into the world's most prolific shipbuilder. The war revealed a fundamental truth of the modern age: that the true measure of a nation's strength was not the size of its army in peacetime, but the depth of its industrial base and the ingenuity of its people. The laughter in Berlin had been the sound of a fading empire, deaf to the roar of the approaching storm. A storm born not in a barracks, but in the vast, humming and deceptively peaceful factories of a nation it had fatally misunderstood.